There is a moment near the end of one of the most beloved musicals ever filmed where two people lean in for a kiss under soft moonlight, and somewhere off camera, a machine is making a noise no love scene should ever have to compete with. For 60 years, audiences believed that scene was pure, effortless romance. It wasn't. It was chaos, hidden in plain sight, dressed up as magic. This is the story of what really happened behind the cameras of The Sound of Music, the near drownings, the drunken performances, the studio cover-ups, and the actor who despised the film he'd be remembered for forever. Long before Julie Andrews ever set foot on an Austrian hillside, the tale of the Von Trapp family had already conquered European movie theaters. In the mid-1950s, German director Wolfgang Liebeneiner adapted Maria von Trapp's memoir into two low-budget films. They weren't polished. They weren't sophisticated. But something about a musical family standing up to the Nazis resonated deeply with a continent still recovering from war. The films became massive hits across Germany and beyond, even reaching South America. Hollywood, when it finally saw them, was unimpressed. Studio executives dismissed the films as amateurish and overly sentimental, closer to a school pageant than cinema. Nobody wanted to touch the story. Nobody, that is, except a director named Vincent J. Donahue, who had just come off a Tony Award win and had an instinct for stories with buried potential. Watching the German films, he saw past the clunky production values and recognized something rare, real emotional weight. His suggestion stunned everyone around him. "Forget film entirely," he said. "Turn this into a Broadway musical and build it around Mary Martin." That single idea set off a chain of events that would eventually produce one of the highest-grossing films in history. But it almost didn't happen, because years earlier, Maria von Trapp had made a financial decision she'd come to regret. Maria wasn't a businesswoman. She had no agent, no legal team, no understanding of what her story might one day be worth. When German producers offered her a flat $9,000 for the rights to her life story in the early 1950s, she took it, grateful for money that would help support her family. Adjusted for today, that's roughly $100,000. It sounds reasonable until you consider what the story eventually generated. Hundreds of millions of dollars across stage and screen. When Hollywood came sniffing around later, they tried a workaround, buying just the title of her book so they could tell a story inspired by her life without dealing with rights complications. Maria refused. If her family story was going to reach the world, she insisted it be told honestly, in full or not at all. Locating her to negotiate the Broadway rights turned into its own saga. By the late 1950s, Mary Martin and her husband Richard Halliday were determined to bring the story to the stage, but Maria was nowhere to be found. She was doing missionary work deep in Papua New Guinea with Father Franz Wasner, the family's former musical director. Letters piled up unopened at remote mission posts. Maria, uninterested in show business and consumed by her work with local communities, tore many of them up without reading a word. It was only after she returned to the United States by ship, docking in San Francisco, that fate intervened. Richard Halliday was waiting at the pier and handed her 2 tickets to see his wife perform in Annie, Get Your Gun. Maria went, likely out of politeness more than curiosity, and left the theater stunned by Mary Martin's stage presence. She had to break the news that the film rights were already gone, sold to the Germans years before. But she offered something else, her blessing to try anyway. The earliest plans for the stage musical didn't call for an entirely original score. Producers wanted to blend real Austrian folk songs with just a couple of new numbers written by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein too. The legendary songwriting duo wasn't interested in a compromise. Their answer was blunt. Either they wrote the entire score or they walked away. That ultimatum reshaped the entire project. Rodgers and Hammerstein were tied up finishing Flower Drum Song, so the Von Trapp musical sat shelved for a stretch. When they returned to it, they scrapped the folk song concept entirely and wrote an all-original score from the ground up, songs that would become cultural fixtures. My Favorite Things, Do-Re-Mi, Edelweiss, Climb Every Mountain. The Broadway production opened on November 16, 1959, at the Lunt-Fontanne Theater, with Mary Martin as Maria and Theodore Bickel as Captain Von Trapp. It cost roughly $400,000 to stage and went on to pull in over $232 million in advance ticket sales alone. Martin missed only a single performance across a run of 1,443 shows spanning nearly 4 years. By 1960, studios were fighting over the film rights, and 20th Century Fox eventually won the bidding war for $1.25 million, a staggering sum for a studio still reeling financially from the disaster of Cleopatra. Buried in that contract was a clause almost nobody took seriously at the time. If the film earned more than $12.5 million, Rodgers and Hammerstein's estate would collect 10% of the profits. Co-writer Howard Lindsay reportedly laughed the clause off. He wouldn't be laughing for long. Before she ever wore a nun's habit on screen, Julie Andrews had already been humiliated by Hollywood once. She had originated the role of Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady on Broadway to widespread acclaim, but when the film adaptation came together, studio executives decided she wasn't camera-ready, code for not glamorous enough by their standards. They cast Audrey Hepburn instead, whose singing had to be dubbed for most of the film. It was a brutal snub. But around the same time, director Robert Wise was searching for his Maria Von Trapp and hadn't yet been sold on Andrews. Everything changed when someone at Disney showed him an unfinished cut of Mary Poppins. Minutes into the footage, Wise reportedly turned to his screenwriter and said they needed to lock her in before another studio noticed. Andrews signed for a flat fee of $225,000, no royalties, no box office percentage. Once she cashed the check, that was the entirety of her financial stake in what would become one of the highest-grossing films ever made. Mary Martin, by contrast, had negotiated a share of Broadway's profits and reportedly earned more than $8 million from a stage run. Fox simply hadn't believed Andrews carried enough star power to warrant the same deal. That decision aged badly. Mary Poppins became a phenomenon, and Andrews won the Academy Award for Best Actress, famously thanking Jack Warner, the very executive who had rejected her for My Fair Lady, in her acceptance speech. Despite The Sound of Music going on to earn hundreds of millions worldwide, Andrews never received a cent beyond that original flat fee. Casting Captain Von Trapp proved to be its own headache. Robert Wise approached Sean Connery, fresh off his star turn as James Bond. He reached out to Richard Burton. He even floated Bing Crosby. None of them fit. Christopher Plummer eventually took the role, but reluctantly, and only after turning it down multiple times. Privately, he mocked the project as overly sweet, reportedly nicknaming it something crude enough that it never appeared in official press. He agreed to sign on only if the writers gave his character more depth, sharper dialogue, more emotional complexity, and a song of his own. That request is why Edelweiss exists at all. Contrary to popular belief, it isn't a traditional Austrian folk song. Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote it specifically to give the captain a moment of quiet vulnerability. Even with those changes, Plummer struggled through the shoot, later admitting he drank during several scenes, including one of the film's most emotionally charged musical moments. And in a twist that infuriated him at the time, most of his singing in the finished film wasn't actually his voice. Professional vocalist Bill Lee, who had also contributed to Disney productions, handled the demanding vocal parts. Plummer's speaking voice carried the dialogue, but the singing that moved millions of viewers largely belonged to someone else. Like Andrews, Plummer worked under a flat contract with no back-end profit share, despite the film eventually grossing close to $286 million worldwide. Of everything that happened during production, nothing tested the cast's composure quite like the gazebo scene. The quiet, moonlit moment where Maria and the captain finally admit their feelings for each other. On screen, it's pure elegance. Off-screen, it nearly didn't get filmed at all. The culprit was the lighting. To simulate moonlight, crews used massive carbon arc lamps, and those lamps produced an unmistakably crude sound every time they activated, a long, flat, unmistakably rude noise. Every time Plummer and Andrews leaned in close, the lights let it rip, and the entire set dissolved into laughter. Andrews later recalled they attempted the scene roughly 20 times, and each attempt collapsed the moment their faces got close enough for the kiss. Eventually, Robert Wise abandoned the original lighting plan entirely and res-hot the sequence in silhouette, framing the couple against the glow of the gazebo windows so their faces were mostly obscured. What audiences experienced as an intentionally dreamy, romantic choice was, in reality, damage control. Fox reportedly discouraged cast and crew from discussing the mishap publicly, and the story stayed largely unknown until Andrews shared it decades later in a television interview. The dangers on set went beyond embarrassment. During the scene where the Vaughn-trapped children capsize in a rowboat, 5-year-old Kim Carruth, who played the youngest daughter, nearly drowned. She couldn't swim, and when the boat flipped, Andrews, who had been positioned to catch her, fell the wrong direction. Carruth went under twice before another cast member pulled her out. The film's now iconic opening shot, with Andrews spinning through an alpine meadow as a helicopter circles overhead, came at a physical cost too. The aircraft flew as low as 20 feet above her, and its downdraft repeatedly knocked her to the ground, by her own account, 6 or 7 times, forcing her to get up, brush herself off, and keep smiling for the camera. Weather made everything worse. Salzburg experienced one of its wettest years on record during filming, turning a planned 6-week location shoot into an 11-week ordeal and straining an already tight $8.2 million budget. And the production almost had an entirely different director. William Wyler was originally attached to the project before quietly backing out, citing scheduling conflicts publicly while privately pursuing a film he felt more creatively connected to. His exit cleared the way for Robert Wise to take the helm in late 1963. None of this chaos showed up in the finished film. What audiences got instead was one of the most successful, most beloved movies ever made, 5 Academy Awards, a box office run that eventually dethroned Gone with the Wind, and songs that are still sung in villages that never had a movie theater. But behind that polish was a production held together by improvisation, endurance, and a cast that kept smiling through disasters the studio never wanted anyone to know about.